When privilege ceases to be your source for exception or indeed guilt, it becomes what political scientists tend to call ally activism. It's a subject that we are going to talk about today with a very special guest, Professor Ankita Pandey. Professor Ankita Pandey studied at Jawaharlal Nehru University, the University of Delhi, and the University of Oxford. She teaches political science. She's a political scientist. She's a professor at Jindal Global University, and she's also a research associate at the Global and Area Studies Department at Oxford. Professor Ankita Pandey is the author of a fascinating book called Becoming Allies, Civil Liberties in Action in India, published by Cambridge University Press. Professor Ankita Pandey, welcome to my podcast. How have you been?
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
So, I asked this question to sociologists and political scientists, and do end up irking them quite a bit. So I hope you don't feel the same way. And that is, does a political scientist look at politics or society in the same way that a scientist looks at water molecules, or is there a fundamental difference?
We have been taught for many years about the essential difference between the scientific method and the social science method. So, of course, a social scientist or a political scientist is interested fundamentally in questions of power, and is no longer looking for the kind of objectivity that we look for in the sciences. So the scientific method seems to be, back in the day at least, more so than today, but seems to be more positivist and more quantifiable and objective than the social science and the political science method, which seems to be more interpretive. So yeah, I'd say that there is a fundamental difference in the method. In fact, at JNU, you mentioned JNU. At JNU, the department is called Center for Political Studies and not Center for Political Science, precisely to mark that kind of divergence.
Yeah, and that interesting distinction between the natural sciences and the human sciences sort of underpins the rationale of your title as well, I suppose. You call your book Becoming Allies. That's a very beautiful title, very polysemic. It could very well be a novel if I had gone into the rest of the description. And that title, Becoming Allies, also delves into the concept of ally activism, which you distinguish from something like a social movement. Now, if I was reading the themes of your book in a civics lesson in my school, then I would be calling this something like a social movement, or maybe a civil rights movement, which you touch on in your subtitle. So your book features a Dramatis Personae of lawyers, professors, judges, and these are people in sort of positions of privilege and a good deal of agency, and they are standing in for people who they have almost no connections with, and surely no kinship with. That is political prisoners. Some of these are Naxalite prisoners and riot victims. And you, by calling this ally activism, you are trying to distinguish it from other kinds of social movements. So why do you think that is important?
Thank you for that question, and also thank you so much for reading the book so closely. Let me start with, just to provide a little bit of context to your question, let me start with a brief sort of description of the book itself, and it will also help the audiences sort of follow the conversation. The book is born out of the question of why is it that some people devote themselves to fighting injustices that don't affect them directly. And I don't mean individually. Why is it that some people actually create a collective platform to do this? And I'm not asking a question of behavioral psychology. I'm not trying to imply that why is it that some people are of superior moral character or something. But I'm approaching this question from a political and a sociological lens. Because we know a great deal about social movements and political parties and protest. And when we think about social movements, think of any of the big movements that must have taken place in the last decade, the narrative is state versus the movement. So this is what the state did, and this is how the movement responded. Or this is a strategy that the movement adopted, and that is how the government reacted. What we know very little about is the people who stand alongside various movement groups, who come to support the movement without being directly affected by the cause. And of course, it is gratifying in many ways to be able to live one's politics. I'm not saying that they don't benefit from, or they don't sort of get any value from their participation, but the book is trying to tell the story of a particular kind of activism, which I call ally activism, through the history of civil liberties groups and their collective practice. So I call them ally activism, and I call the process by which they make these struggles visible the politics of amplification. Now, what do? They help connect movements with institutions. They might help bring public support. They might ensure that issues are being heard by the communities that are directly, beyond the communities that are directly affected, but also to the larger public. So in the book I say that they serve as a kind of an infrastructure, like they are creating a mechanism through which local voices and struggles become visible, credible, and difficult to ignore. And I'm looking at the 1960s to 1980s. This is a time when social media is not present. Movements don't have the kind of, to use a popular word, PR. They can't do the PR that we now can with the presence of social media. And I'm trying to talk about how democracy actually depends on this infrastructure being in place, so that claims can travel from local, groups that are protesting to the district court, to the high court, to the Supreme Court, or to the national media, or to the right people or the right institutions. So they build links between movements, court, media, and the public. So that was my reason for not using the term social movement, or even not using the broad term activist. Those are both fine. It's not like it's incorrect to use them, but they don't actually point to, or they don't quite capture the distinct form of politics that this is. Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little more about
so maybe we can discuss this as we go on. But I was thinking while reading particular sections of the book, and my next question was about the two metropolitan spaces, Calcutta and Delhi, during the 60s and the 70s, especially the JP Andolan, the Naxalite movement. But prior to that, even while reading the introduction, I was wondering if the history of colonial India couldn't have been given a new direction if we were to evaluate it through the lens of this concept. Anyway, that's a theme for later concern. But my next question would be, you write in your book that Delhi and Calcutta used to approach the central government in different ways, and activists from Delhi and activists from Calcutta had very different views of the center. So Calcutta was skeptical. It was skeptical of Gandhi. We know it was also skeptical of the Indian state. And for right reasons. We have had personal histories, and many of us have read about this in books of how the policing of or the police state of the 1970s and that particular regime created such a bloody divide between the Naxalites on the one hand and the common citizenry, and there were losses on both sides, and there was a brutal crackdown by the police. So Calcutta had very good reasons to be skeptical of the state. New Delhi, on the other hand, was more believing towards the center, but its dreams were crushed after 1975. So is there some allegorical value you are trying to draw from this? And are there any parallels that you find? And I know your book is not about the 21st century, but just off the cuff, would you like to draw any parallels, or do you think that would be an overstretch?
Thank you again. So the colonial India bit that you said, I actually continue to be very interested in. So I wish I had the skills of a historian and be able to access archives, because I would be very interested in trying to track the history of fact-finding as a social movement tactic, independently done fact-finding by a group of citizens that come together. I would very much be interested in seeing how far back it goes, how its history, and that would definitely be in colonial India, and hopefully someday I will find the time to do that. as a person who, so there is a very strong, I must start by kind of a disclaimer, there is a very strong civil liberties activism in southern India, and Andhra being one of the very, very important location. But given my sort of limitations of language, I chose to look at Delhi and Kolkata. The reason being that Delhi is the place that sees the first national civil liberties groups in India, and Kolkata is one of the places where civil liberties activism began in 1972. There's a group called Association for Protection of Democratic Rights, APDR, and the APDR comes in, is formed just in the aftermath of the counterinsurgency operations against the Naxalite movement. So I went and met activists in both these spaces, in Calcutta and in Delhi, and these are first generation people who were in their 20s in that period, 70s to 80s. They're in their 20s or 30s. So now, at the time that I was interviewing them, they were in their 70s and 80s, and looking back at their activism. Now, what interested me, and of course I'm not saying that everyone in one city thinks in one way, but what was a striking contrast is that a lot of the times the people in Calcutta would talk about how they were deeply, as you mentioned, they were deeply skeptical of state power from the outset. They were not approaching the question of bail for one of their comrades who is, jailed, or the origin is not that. They kept using the word tactical. We went and we approached the courts tactically. So it was a strategy. They were making it very clear that it's a strategy. While the people in Delhi were, quite a few of them, overwhelmingly so, said that the emergency was a watershed moment for us. In 1975, one of them told me that I can't believe that Nehru's daughter would do that. So there was a sense of disenchantment. And so their journey was from a place of faith to disenchantment, while a lot of the activists in Calcutta, the journey was from skepticism to some degree of, strategic use. And so that contrast really was useful for me to establish the point that there isn't a single political tradition that gave birth to civil liberties activism. The activism has multiple origins. There are those who are liberal and Democrats, and there are those who are from the left. In Calcutta, for a lot of them, it emerged in the context of state's violence in response to the Naxalite movement, and in Delhi, for many of them, it started with the anti-emergency mobilization, which had disappointed them and which then transformed them. So they were talking much more in a constitutional framework, with some degree faith in democratic institution and the hope that they will be able to bring it back. So there was a restoration, there was an element of restoration that I did not find as much in Calcutta. So I think the contrast, the contrast helps me talk about how commitment to civil liberties can be shaped by very different political journeys. People don't arrive at it from the same route.
In terms of the perception of these groups, sorry to use that very loose phrase, these groups, I almost sound like prime time television media. But yeah, that's the subject of my next question. So when we look at, within quotes, these groups, civil rights activists or ally activists, we tend to, especially when we are very skeptical, we tend to club them as non-state actors, and we mean that phrase pejoratively generally, as actors, as agents with some kind of hidden incentive, hidden agendas. Maybe they are funded by the opposition, again within quotes. So this is relatively a post-social media phenomenon. But what kind of history does it have in India? Were political parties, was the press calling civil rights activists non-state actors funded by the opposition even back in the 60s, 70s, 80s?
Actually, interestingly, well before the current moment, well before social media, governments of different colors across independent India and globally civil liberties activism or any activism that is seeking to expose the official truth or official narrative around something typically gets these, so the attempt is not to oppose what activists are saying. The government's attempt is to delegitimize it. And the way to delegitimize something is to use one of 3, 4, repeated sort of, and as I said, you can observe this globally. The trope of it being foreign funded, or the trope of this being unpatriotic or anti-national in some way, or the trope of it being the overground face of something that is actually an underground movement, or people who are somehow interested in bringing shame. So I remember, as you mentioned, I remember that Ashis Nandy has this book where he has mentioned an activist who was opposing he calls this activist one of India's first environmentalist. And he's writing to the government consistently opposing the Damodar Valley Corporation. So that it's sort of one of the first articulations against Big Dam and its aftering. And Nandy shows how the Amrit Bazar Patrika had reported about this activist saying this is Pakistan funded or foreign funded. No, actually not Pakistan. They said that this is a hostile foreign power that has possibly, that possibly is encouraging this person to say these things. So it's very interesting that this has been the trope. And I think that it's an ongoing battle. I think it will always be that way. The authorities will, I think it's meant to be, like the way I see it, it's meant to be an adversarial system, and it sort of works only when it remains adversarial in that manner. But your bit about the chapter in the book is it refers to a set of scholars in the 1980s, 1984 to be specific, Rajni Kothari, Harsh Sethi, and D.L. Sheth, who had coined the term non-party political formations, because this is a time when a range of grassroots movements and social movements in India are emerging. And to capture all of that, they had come up with this term non-party political movements, and they deeply believe that these movements have come up because of a certain disappointment with political parties. So political parties are not able to represent the people, and therefore people are having to choose other groups. Now, I thought that when it came to civil liberties groups, this term or this label, non-party political formations, didn't quite fit. Because when I interviewed the activists, I noticed that they are not non-party in the sense that they are not removed from party. They are not sort of operating in a zone that is away from party. Many of the leading civil liberties activists had been members of political parties. During the emergency, they worked very closely with parties of the opposition. Some later joined the Janta government. Some advised political parties. So I noticed that it was perhaps the label non-party was a little misleading, and therefore I say that it might be a better idea to talk of them as third party, because the third party kind of is sort of allows us to understand that they are independent, they are guarding their organizational autonomy quite carefully, and they are engaging with political parties as and when they need to. So they're lobbying with them. Sometimes they defended people across ideological divides. They have criticized governments of different political colors. So they disagree with parties. They are sometimes working with political parties, and that's why I thought that third party is actually a better way to understand analytically their location than non.
That's also very useful to understand something like the Cockroach Janta Party. I think it is very openly a third party embodied agent. Wouldn't you say that?
Yes, absolutely. The Cockroach Janta Party, I think, because it was able to mobilize very big numbers, I think that it would be completely fair to call them a social movement, like any other social movement. I think, one difference between civil liberties groups, and your audiences will feel that, I'm sure you will, these are not groups that are reported by newspapers. At most, they'll say civil society groups, or sometimes they'll say human rights groups. But you don't actually know names, you don't know people, because much of this work is, in fact, that the work of supporting someone is done by somewhat invisibilizing oneself. The idea is to At least the logic of this kind of politics is not to get spotlight on oneself. Of course, that is not to say that this never happens, but I'm saying the logic of the politics is not to have spotlight on oneself, but on the issue that you want amplified. So in that sense, there's a difference between something like the Cockroach Janata Party, which mobilizes large numbers on the streets, and something like civil liberties activism, where you get a lawyer to work pro bono for a political prisoner. That's never going to become a mass issue on which thousands of people are going to show up at Jantar Mantar. So it's a very different kind of work. It's relatively quieter work.
Yeah. So which is what brings me to my next question, because I think I told you in the beginning of this conversation that there's something quite ennobling about that title, Becoming Allies. It is. I did feel like it was a slight less visibilization of the I or the egotistical, identity, and surely it was, draining away of your privilege, a self-conscious draining away, which makes me think: is there something distinctly ontologically Gandhian about this? You mentioned Gandhi. You mentioned the fact-finding investigation spearheaded by Gandhi in 1917 in Champaran. Walk us through that, and please do tell us if it's not too much of an overreading that there's something Gandhian in ally activism, in that you're trying to use a vocabulary and idiom, in this case of the law, to fight against the state, even when you perhaps do not believe in the law, or you don't believe in the law anymore. Gandhi was a barrister, he was a lawyer, and he had a practice in South Africa, but perhaps in India, law is not the first thing that he believes in anymore. He believes in many other kinds of institutions like Satyagraha, like Ahimsa, but he still continues to stick to law quite rigorously. So is using the idiom of the other, and in this case, the other is a much bigger entity than yourself. In this case, it's the state, the colonial state, using their vocabulary to try and instill reform in them. Quite typically biblical, wouldn't you say? So is that what ally activism is also aiming for?
Yeah, again, thank you. That's a very interesting question and something I'd be happy to think more on. See, using the law doesn't necessarily mean that activists, Gandhi included, would believe that the legal system is perfect or that the legal system is even just. There is something, and I want to kind of think about it deeply and write about it someday. There is something about the using the form of law. In fact finding, when you convert people's testimonies into a format that is compatible with evidentiary acts and is admissible in a court, it acquires a certain credibility that just memory or people's narratives do not have. So law can become a strategic sort of resource for activists to challenge the state on its own terms. Something, as I said, something that is admissible in a court of law. Now that Gandhi did quite well. And one of the things I have tried to show in the book is that this has a long history in India. We mentioned colonial India. Fact-finding, in fact, emerged well before the modern human rights movement in the Indian subcontinent, back in the anti-colonial time. So 1917 and even before, Gandhi does this inquiry in Champaran. We know this inquiry very well against the kinds of taxes that were imposed on indigo plantations, and he organized a very systematic investigation. He and his colleagues, they traveled across villages. Someone from the CID was there. They recorded testimonies of peasants. They would get the peasants to put a thumbprint. They would read out the testimony back to the peasant to ensure that they are documenting it properly. They would assemble evidence around it, and in many ways it actually mirrored an official inquiry, even though it was conducted independently. And that's what I mean by the form of the law actually helps acquire credibility even in movement politics. That now these reports, many of them may not ever go to a court, but that form helps it acquire certain public visibility and credibility. And now that practice becomes some kind of a template. So to that extent, one can say that this is Gandhian. In that civil liberties fact-finding groups have traveled to sites of violence. They have continued to interview witnesses. I think the People's Union for Democratic Rights has done more than 3,000 fact-finding investigations. They collect testimonies, they will reconstruct the events, they will produce reports, and they will challenge the official version of what had happened. And when I was speaking to these activists, they aren't naive about law. Many of them know that courts can fail, governments can ignore, legal norms, justice can be deeply unequal, and yet they continue to use legal language, legal procedure, and constitutional principle because they think that this is one way in which the state can be publicly held accountable and be shown a mirror. But would I say that the civil liberties movement in that sense is Gandhian? It's Gandhian plus other traditions, and so there are Gandhians, but as I just said, there are also liberal Democrats who I mentioned, were very disappointed with the imposition of the internal emergency. There are socialists who are a very big number of Gandhian socialists are the opposition back in the day, and there are of course Marxists who are part of this. So the practice of fact finding and Champaran does become a milestone, which later civil liberties groups inherit, but there is certainly more ideologies that pool into it.
Right. Which is very interesting, and which feeds into my next question, which perhaps might be the last one for you today, I hope, because we hope to have you back many more times. So, Professor Pandey, I was just thinking this is perhaps not directly related to your discipline and to your theoretical vocabulary, but I couldn't help but recount the cultural theorist Raymond Williams, who brings, to my knowledge, a very significant change in the way we look at cultural history in general, meaning broadly experiences located in time. So we tend to, or we used to, look at history maybe 50 years ago as being rather straightforward. There's an official version and there's an unofficial version. But it seems like there are multiple strands of history that one can think of. And Raymond Williams referred to at least three kinds of structures of feeling. As he called them, there was the dominant, there was the residual, which was trying to both oppose the dominant, but feel about a previous dominant and hoping for its return in the future dominant. And then there was the emergent, which was perhaps antagonistic to both. Now, ally activism, I'm focusing on that concept here. When a book like this comes out, and when a member of the common public like myself looks at the book, we tend to think sometimes that is this book going to make any difference? And sometimes that's a positive skepticism, and sometimes that could be a very negative kind of skepticism in which we do not really want it to make a difference, and therefore we are skeptical. So my question, rather bluntly, is this currency trying to capture, is it trying to describe a kind of reality as it has been shaped in the past, and as it has been shaping society until the 80s and the 90s? Or is this concept, ally activism, does it contain certain reaffirmative possibilities of helping reality evolve as well? To put it somewhat in a simpler language, is it capturing a structure of feeling? Or is it also trying to take advantage of the knowledge of that structure of feeling, by distinguishing itself from social movements? Can ally activists learn to help better kinds of evolution in social movements and civil rights movements in the future? I don't know if that's making sense to you.
No, absolutely, and thank you. There's the two or three sort of wonderful things to think about, and you are absolutely right. The book looks at a particular period in history, but I am myself very interested in trying to look at the question of civil liberties activism today. What is its shape? What is the state of allyship and ally activism today? And one of the spaces that I look at is digital liberties activism. A lot of the concerns around liberty, around opposition to censorship, around ensuring that the digital divide reduces, against content moderation online, against internet shutdowns entirely. So a lot of the activism around this, so the question of liberties seems to have also substantially moved into the digital realm, just as governance moves into the digital realm. So that is one part of this. Now, even today, of course, now, as I mentioned before, maybe movements in remote areas no longer need actual physical group of people to convey and carry their message from the sort of remote rural areas to the national capital. With the presence of social media, they can amplify it themselves. But what they do need is still an infrastructure that will help ensure that their claims actually travel to the right locations. So the documenting, the providing of the legal aid, the conducting of fact-finding, the support that journalists or audiences can provide, that remains very significant even today. In fact, I would be very surprised if there is any movement. Maybe the movement always reaches a point where it needs a crack in the system. And it could be a person who will leak some information, or it could be someone who is a little more sympathetic to the movement that will actually talk to those in authority. But there will often be an intermediary who plays some role within most movement contexts. And I actually think that its need in the present, like the need for ally activism in the present, is not diminished at all. It has perhaps become even more important given how polarized things are today. So given that polarization, I think all this work, documenting the abuses or providing legal aid or creating documentaries or doing fact finding and defending people in court is continues to be very, very important. This bit about structural change and the structure of healing, ally activism by itself, of course, will not produce structural change. Civil liberties groups will not be able to abolish inequality or even patriarchy or even communal violence or even transform the state structure. They are very state facing, but they cannot do that. What they will do, as I said previously, is they will create an infrastructure a little bit like a road, and they will make sure that evidence does not disappear. It reaches the right places. They will connect local struggles to the wider public, and that translation of grievances or that passing the mic on to the local group is important. Now, in terms of this sort of structure of feeling, I'm not a person who has studied literary theory, but I can say that the first generation civil liberties activists who I met, they definitely inhabited a particular political world. There was some sense of a collectively shared sense of what is ethical self-conduct in politics. Like, what am I expected to do politically? As a person of some privilege, as a person who has education, as a person who can speak English language, as a person who has a friend from my college days or school days that is now a bureaucrat or now a senior police officer. So the cultural and the sort of financial capital that a certain group of salaried professionals had in the 1960s, 70s, they definitely had a collectively held value of wanting to be a vigilant citizen to ensure that state actors do not abuse the immense power they have, and perhaps even a desire for leadership, like to do something in society, to lead in some ways. So to that extent, maybe they do inhabit a structure of sort of feeling, or I'm more familiar with political theory, so I would say, what Hegel had called a zeitgeist. But they do draw from several different traditions. So in that sense, it's ideologically a little bit diverse. So from left sympathizers to Gandhian, to socialists, to liberals, many of them share this collective sort of sense, and even a romance for constitutionalism and constitutional politics.
Correct.
That is shared across.
Institutions, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. Please go on. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I was done. I was saying that there was a shared need to keep the state accountable, a shared sense of wanting to play a role in politics. Now, in the Gandhian, if you look at these ideologies, the Gandhian emphasis on seva and to not join government, but to continue to work in some kind of a civil society domain. The sort of Marxist emphasis on vanguard politics. Now, all of them are actually coming together to influence a generation of people who have a collective sense of ethical conduct.
Well, fascinating, and I hope we come back to the book in the coming months. Professor Pandey, thank you so much for giving me your valuable time, and thank you so much for taking all the time to answer my somewhat convoluted questions.
Thank you so much, Agi. I think the questions were great, and a couple of them have also helped me think about what I could do next. So thank you for that.
That's very kind of you. Dear audience, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast of the Unofficial Seminar. And please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And Professor Pandey, thank you once again for giving me your precious time. And I hope to see you soon in the same institution that employs both of us. Dear audience, until next time,